Our first presenter is from Lawrence County, Alabama, where he grew up. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Alabama in Political Science and History in 2000. He then went on to graduate from the University of Alabama School of Law, summa cum laude, in 2004, and was elected to the Order of the Coif and served as senior editor of the Alabama Law Review at the University of Alabama School of Law. Chris practices with the law firm of Bradley, Arant, Bolt, and Cummings. I can personally vouch for him. He works with me in my work as general counsel of a corporation in town, and he does an excellent job. He practices in the field of corporations, limited liability companies, asset purchases and sales, stock purchases and sales, buy-sell agreements, and other related matters. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. I see a few of you out there smiling. It is true, I did show up for this 2 weeks early to give this presentation, and then tonight I showed up an hour early. I think that's just an indication of how anxious I am to talk to you folks about corporations. Tonight I will talk about the characteristics, the advantages and the disadvantages of conducting your business as a corporation, the steps required to incorporate, and then once you do incorporate, what are some of the actions, some of the steps you can take to protect that entity. But I guess the best place to start is just by asking the question, what is a corporation? A corporation is an artificial entity, a legal entity that is separate, apart, and distinct from the individual owners, the shareholders. And this is a feature I will repeat numerous times because it's this notion of a separate entity from the shareholders that the corporation derives most of its advantages. Corporations exist in Alabama under a statute known as the Alabama Business Corporations Act. Other states have similar statutes, so corporations are largely a matter of state law. I think it's important to say that you don't need a large business to have a corporation. Okay, I would say a majority of the corporations formed in Alabama each month are smaller type business operations. Even someone with a home-based business can find the benefits of incorporation very helpful. So let's take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of conducting your business as a corporation. And I'll start out with an example. Let's say that I want to start a new business, okay? I want to start a kitchen cabinet business, okay? I don't prepare any documents. I don't make any filings, okay? I just go out, I buy a hammer, a tool belt, a screw gun. I call myself Chris's Cabinets, and I just start doing work. I start installing cabinets. Now, I'm conducting business at that point as a sole proprietorship, okay? A sole proprietorship is the simplest form of doing business. No filings are required, no paperwork is done, and the key feature is that you are conducting business as an individual, okay? No separate entity is created. So what that means is the owner is going to be directly liable for all the debts and obligations of that business, okay? So if I go out and I install a set of cabinets, okay, and I do a poor job, the wall cabinets I hang in your kitchen fall off, do damage to your property, worse yet, hurt you, you're not going to be happy, okay? And if you bring suit against my business, at that point, I'm personally liable, okay? My home, my cars, my personal bank accounts are at risk of being lost. And it's that feature, that personal liability, that is the driving force for many folks to form a type of business organization, including corporations, okay? So let's assume I go through the proper steps to incorporate that we'll talk about in a little more detail in a few minutes. I make those filings and I become a corporation, okay? What are those advantages? Well, number one is limitation of liability, okay? Shareholders, the owners of a corporation, are not liable generally for the debts and obligations of the corporation, okay? And so, another example, I'm installing my cabinets, I bust a pipe in your kitchen, that causes, your basement to flood with water. Obviously, you're not going to be happy with me. If you bring suit at that point, you're going to be limited to looking for the corporation for relief. even though I personally am the one who busted that pipe, absent some circumstances, you're going to be limited to looking after, going after the assets of the corporation. Now, limitation of liability does not mean a complete absence of liability, okay? Whatever money, property, or other assets that I have contributed to the corporation will be, at risk. If I've contributed $100 to the corporation, then at that point that's a corporate asset that can be lost. But again, my house, my cars, my personal bank accounts will be shielded from liability. Now, that's the general rule. There is an exception known as piercing the corporate veil, where courts will sometimes, in extreme circumstances, set aside that limited liability shield of the corporation and hold shareholders personally responsible for corporate debts. Okay, that's obviously not a good thing, and we'll talk about later on what are some of the things you can do to avoid that happening. Another advantage of corporations, it's a common mode of business ownership. Folks are just more comfortable dealing with corporations. They've been around for a long time. Along with that, the court systems have had plenty of opportunity to judge different issues, and so there's a well-established body of case law with corporations. It's easier for owners of corporations to predict how courts will come out on a particular issue, and corporations also offer flexibility with regard to employee benefits. If your business is going to have a stock option plan or a profit sharing plan, corporations can provide you some flexibility there. Now, disadvantages, and I'm going to differentiate between two types of corporations, C corporations and S corporations, or small business corporations. And that distinction relates to how those entities are taxed. Okay? For C corporations, you're going to face, in some circumstances, what's known as a double tax. Okay? That's where you, as an owner, a shareholder of the corporation, and that corporate entity both pay tax on the same dollar of income. Okay? And so in my example, let's say my cabinet corporation has a net profit of $10,000. Okay? That entity is separate and distinct from me individually as a shareholder, and so it's going to file a tax return and pay tax on the money it has coming in. Okay? So that $10,000 is going to be taxed at the corporate level. Okay? If the corporation then turns around and issues me as a shareholder a dividend of $5,000, well, at that point I individually have income. Okay? So on my personal income tax return, I'll have to pay tax on that $5,000. Okay? So at the end of the day, that $5,000 has been taxed twice. Okay? Once at the corporate level, and then once again at the individual level in my hands. Now, there are ways to mitigate that double tax, ways to get around it. Rather than issuing me a dividend, the corporation can reinvest those profits back into the company. It can buy a new delivery truck, lease more office space, or if I'm an employee of the corporation, then perhaps part of that $5,000 can be paid to me as a part of my salary, at which point the corporation would be entitled to a deduction for that amount. Okay? Now, S corporations have the same benefits as C corps. They give you that all-important limited liability protection, flexibility with regard to employee benefits. But a primary advantage it has over C corps is that it avoids that double tax problems. Okay? For S corps, that money coming in is only taxed at the individual level. Okay? So you don't pay tax twice. It only flows through to the individual shareholders. Now, you may be asking, well, why doesn't every corporation do that? That sounds pretty good. The reason is there are certain requirements that you have to meet to be taxed as an S corp to make that S corp election. First of all, you can have no more than 100 shareholders. Okay, so it places a limit on the number of owners you can have in your corporation. Generally, those shareholders must be U.S. citizens or residents, individuals. Okay, and so the general rule is no entity shareholders, corporations, LLCs. There are a few small exceptions to that, but the general rule is individual share ownership. And then finally, you can only have one class of stock. Okay, so if you've got common shares out there in your corporation, You can't create classes of preferred shares with different rights and preferences that you may need to issue to investors that come in. Okay. I do want to talk just for a second about another form of entity, the limited liability company, which is, I'm sure a lot of you folks have heard of. It's a relatively new form of organization, started back in the 70s, and I would probably say that LLCs are the fastest growing type of entity because they do offer a large number of advantages. Okay? They give you that limited liability protection that is, again, probably the driving force of why most folks choose to form an organization. It also avoids the double tax problem by only taxing those amounts at the individual level. And unlike S corporations, you don't have those restrictions that you have to meet in order to avoid that double tax. Now, disadvantages for LLCs are that they haven't been around that long. Okay, and so that well-established body of case law we talked about for corporations isn't there for LLCs. Okay, so it's harder to predict how courts might come out on a particular issue if an issue goes to litigation. Okay, and also LLCs can be more expensive to set up than corporations because while they offer a tremendous amount of flexibility in the way you set it up, that flexibility often takes more time and effort to craft in your documents when you're creating that entity. Before we talk about the steps you take to actually incorporate your business, I do want to talk for just a second about what I'll call the corporate form. Okay? I'm sure you've all heard the terms shareholders, directors, officers, and I want to take just a second to talk about each of those individual roles, who they are, what they do, and what their responsibilities are. And the general allocation of power is amongst those three parties. Number one are shareholders. Shareholders are the owners of the corporation. Okay? They are the equity owners. They own that separate entity. Okay? They act primarily through electing directors to run the corporation, and shareholders also have the right to approve of certain fundamental changes for the corporation, corporations that are not in the ordinary course of business.